Well, welcome to another episode of the Grazing Sheep Podcast. I'm your host, Big Tom Perkins, along with Dr. Cameron Meyerly, and we're going to continue our discussion here today on some of these soil health principles. And I
Yeah,
think,
and we thought we have, four more left out of the five that are on that list, depending on what list you're looking at and where you're finding it at. But the two that we thought made the most sense to kind of go together was plant diversity and then the concept of keeping a living root in the soil. So when you're thinking plant diversity, Tom, it tends to be in our pasture systems that we already have some level of diversity. Is there a level that you feel, too much is you have too much diversity or not enough in some certain areas?
well, I suppose you could have too much diversity if all of a sudden if you got a bunch of trees growing where you don't want a bunch of trees growing. The big thing with the diversity is, we know that in a grazing situation, animals want not just straight grass, not just straight legumes, not just straight forbs, not just straight sedges. You know, they're wanting a little bit of all that. I always think about the fact that you have all these different shaped leaves there. And so you're capturing solar energy from every angle possible. And nothing's able to get down to the ground ever just because there's all that different leaf cover and different shapes and so on. But I think that's a huge part of it is
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I think again we have to think these soil health principles really apply to all of agriculture.
hmm
And so in this area, is this something we struggle with as ruminant producers utilizing pasture? No, it's not. Like this is not the section that we really have to be concerned about from a soil health standpoint. Um, I think this applies more to some row crop agriculture, on the agronomic side of things, when we're looking at monocultures and then how do we implement diversity there. And it not to chase that rabbit hole, but um, there's a lot of stuff that's kind of changing and a lot of producers that are trying some new things, even if that's the implementation of cover crops for a portion of the year. That's diversifying the plant species that you're seeing in that field, and thus diversifying what's going on below the soil surface.
yeah, each each class of plant, and just recently I started hearing about plant families, and that was something I'd never really thought about before, but I just kind of I've just recently kind of dove into that hole and kind of looking around to see what's there. But you know, every different species of plant is going to put out a different root exudate. It's going to have a different root system. It's going to have different beneficial insects that are going to be attracted to that plant. There's uh, there's a huge amount of carbon, that's being pulled out of the atmosphere constantly. That goes into that, and carbon's what drives that whole biology system. That's that CO2 where it's pulling in those that carbon and releasing that oxygen. That carbon is the food that just feeds everything. And so the your bigger your diversity, whether you're in a row crop system or whether you're in a pasture system, as most of us are, that is just huge. And I think that's where that diversity comes into. And you start looking at those different root systems in that in the context of diversity, you've got plants that are going way deep into a soil that are pulling out just certain minerals, certain nutrients, just seeking that stuff out. It's it is absolutely amazing. You'd have to be a soil biologist with side degree in chemistry, I think, to understand all that's happening down there.
Yeah, and those individuals don't have all the answers either on
No, they're
on
discovering
what's actually happening below that plant communication, and as you had mentioned, root exudates. Um, that is something that is difficult to capture in a scientific model. It's something that's not always it's just not visible to us. We can certainly run through some tests and look at the activity between some of those plants, but as soon as we start looking at it, we've disturbed the environment in which they're communicating in. Um,
oh, yeah. Yeah,
and so it's
it would be a hard thing to study, but they're finding more and more things going on in there. It's just how many years ago we thought that there was only one kind of mycorrhizal fungi. Now they're discovering there's hundreds, if not thousands, of different kinds of mycorrhizal fungi.
right, and this stuff is current.
Oh yeah.
It's very much on the cutting edge, and we're seeing advancement continuously in this field, and that's why it's kind of exciting. I do think from a sheep production standpoint, there's one facet of diversity that I feel that we understand already, um, and that's more from a nutrient development standpoint and um, what other plants need. So, when we're thinking about inclusion of legumes into predominantly grass pastures, the
Hmm.
reason that works, there's a couple things. First off, we're thinking plant growth.
Yep.
If we have grasses that are utilizing that need nitrogen and improve performance with the in the presence of nitrogen, and then we add a legume to that that's fixating nitrogen, and we're not going to get into that and what's causing that today. um, but as that nitrogen is then released, there's a relationship between that grass and legume
Hmm.
that improves both plants. um, and so like we know that exists, and along with that plant diversity on that ground provide we know our legumes are tend to be higher in crude protein.
Hmm.
So we can add crude protein, we can add some calcium, a lot of things that kind of mesh together and work in tandem nicely are things that we're implementing for animal production, but they also improve soil health. And so that's just something that, again, like seeing how the soil health and things that improve there are actually beneficial to the livestock side of the operation. I think the more of those we can find and implement, it's huge. Uh, the other thing I was thinking that when we're thinking about diversity, if you've ever been in a field of um, orchard grass, field with a lot of orchard grass, it would not be what we would consider a sod forming plant.
Nope.
So like it's pretty easy. You can twist an ankle in a high percentage orchard grass field without a lot of diversity in
Mm.
there. Um, all of those bunches, all of those clumps are not doing the job of soil armor. And so we need something else as sod forming legume grass in that mix that really benefits us as producers, and then also covers that soil, changes the diversity in that field. So there's probably 100 different examples. We're not we're not going to cover every single one of them, or even try. But I guess where have you seen diversity have a positive impact, or maybe even change through the grazing practices that you already have? Um, have you seen any changes in your pasture diversity?
Yeah, we definitely have. Oh, some were positive, some were negative. We have a hillside that used to be nothing but briars, and from doing a little bit of bale grazing on that hillside. Those briars are just about gone. And
Mm.
that was a good bit to do with animal impact, as well as just suddenly we changed. I think through the bale grazing, we changed the available nutrients that were there, and it just brought on all these other plants that we hadn't, seen in that spot before. All of a sudden, grasses and legumes started popping up, and a lot of warm season grasses started popping up on the hillside too. That was kind of the amazing part. That was about the first place we saw warm season grasses come. I think maybe they just didn't have any competition at that point and took the opportunity to grow. But I know too, we're seeing every year we're seeing way more birchfoot trefoil than we ever saw before. I've got pictures of a field, and that's just seems, unless you really look close, that's pretty much what all you see is birchfoot trefoil. But I think that's part of that. Through grazing, we were able to change that diversity, where before that was primarily grasses. We were going in and just mowing to take hay off. That's pretty much all you saw was grasses.
Yeah, and I think, like you had mentioned, it can be positive or negative. In a situation, a more continual grazing situation, or continuous grazing situation, animals are going out and consuming plants of higher palatability.
Hmm.
And so we always have pressure on those plants. We allow for competition to of our maybe less beneficial or less palatable plants. We allow competition to kind of take over and give those plants the edge. And so I guess you could probably say in that situation we're reducing diversity. I also think, as I think there's kind of a set limit on diversity. If we let stuff go, um, at some point, as you had mentioned, trees.
Hmm.
So long term, looking at that, trees, the biggest competition they offer, water absorption and shade. And
Yep.
so if you've ever been into a woodland setting, and it takes a long time for it to happen, but eventually, we reduce diversity under that tree canopy because we don't have sunlight. Um, I think the same could be said for our pasture settings where we have that animal in a continuous in a continuous grazing situation. We limit diversity to a certain point because we're limiting items from really thriving in that setting.
You
Um,
absolutely would, because that's what's happening is you're just stressing those plants so
mhm.
bad they just give up, they quit growing, they die. And your more hardy plants that can survive will start coming through. And that's why when you watch these you watch these fields that people just abandon, they no longer farm. It starts off with this nice thick grass growth, and then that grass dies, and at that point you're starting to change it from a more bacterial uh dominated soil. Now you're going to start pushing it towards a more fungal bacteria, or yeah, fungal soil. And that's when you start getting your woody species. And that's just how it all works. If you leave it to its own devices, it will all go back to trees. Just
Right.
simply because you have that uh grasses that and legumes and so on that have all gone into senesce, and now they've died, and there's not that much there anymore for your bacteria to feed on. And that's when your fungal start coming in to clean up what's left. And that's how you push that over to that. So you can go to either extreme. And I think that's where your rotational grazing comes in as well, because you're creating an environment where the diversity can thrive.
Yeah, when I think it all ties back into competition. Yeah, I think competition is this biological catalyst that really propels what we're going to have and
Mhm.
performance of these species out in the environment. We could even argue under the soil surface. Um, but that, we're talking about plant diversity, and the part of that plant that we want to keep in that soil, and that's really our next principle, is living roots.
Yep.
So when you're thinking of a living root, does the dormant plant still have a living root?
Yep. I think it does. I think it 100% does. It's still putting off root exudates. It still has the, oh, what's that called? Rhizosphere, where it's got, exudates that it's put out and it's protecting those roots. They talk about rhizosheaths. You can actually pull out a healthy root system without breaking it all up. You'll see these, they look like Rostafon hair. I don't know what that's called, like dreadlocks, I guess.
Right.
They're coming down over those roots, and you can actually grab a hold of those up close to the plant itself, and you can peel those off, and you'll look, and there's just a hollow center down through where that root was in there being protected by all that. It's yeah, I think that root is working, all year long. And
Right. And it's
that
something
that
that,
just keeps your biology working.
yeah, and I guess where do you cross over from that live, because I would agree with you that even in the dormant plant, we have a root that is going to uh, do its job and accomplish what needs to be done the following growing season.
Mhm.
But I guess if that's the case, what are dead roots? How do we cause that? And where are we going to see those?
Well, you can cause them a number of different ways, I guess. You know, we talk about plants that winter kill, and I've never heard anybody talk about it, but I suppose if you take, for instance, like oats, you plant oats in the fall, you can get a good graze out of it. And then in theory, most of that, you get enough cold weather. What is it, 3 nights below 20 degrees for X number of hours,
Right.
or 25 degrees or 28 degrees,
Yeah,
whatever that
I wanna
number
say it's
is.
like a random, I wanna say like 20, I don't know why, 23 degrees is like
Okay, yeah,
what's
yeah,
in my head. There is no reason for it to be 23 degrees specifically, but it's a sustained temperature at a set number of hours below
yeah,
freezing.
and that
Um,
kills that plant. So
correct.
so if the plant is killed, we're gonna have to assume that the roots are dead because that's part of the plant. And,
Yeah, and I guess that was my point is we're not looking at roots out in the pasture.
yeah,
The only thing that we have to observe is the plant above the soil surface on
true.
an easy basis. So, like, if we see a dead plant, it truly dead, we can then assume those roots are decaying there under the soil surface.
Yeah,
That is no longer a living root
right.
system.
Now I think I think that's all part of the system. I think you have to have those dead roots.
And you
Uh,
will.
one, at this point, whatever carbon those dead roots have accumulated, now that's being stored in the ground. That's not coming back out. The uh the other part of that with dead roots is now once that is completely decayed, you now have a channel down in there for air and water to work its way down in. I think those dead roots too are, are still food for biology. It's still food for worms.
Right. And those would be considered macropores, correct?
I would think so. Yeah.
Where that root is left. And we're thinking macropores, one of the primary examples, um, especially in a cropping system, and we know we've talked about them on here. Um, use them in a pasture rotation or a renovation plan, but items like turnips, items like tillage radishes that are creating this large cavity
Mhm.
breaking up, some items of compaction, those negative situations we've talked about before, and so that would be a root that is no longer living once that plant dies off. But
And I think the thing to remember too about those radishes and turnips and so on, it's not that big bulb that we see that everybody's always so proud of, and I like to post that on Facebook, you know.
right,
'Cause we have we've had some pretty big ones at times, and you think, "Holy cats, that's really doing its job." But it's that teeny tiny little root at the bottom of that. That usually when you pull that, you pull that plant out, you get that picture of that little root just snaps right off. But it's that little root is what goes down in there and really starts to break up your compaction and so on. It's not the other. I've heard a lot of guys around here talk about, "Oh, yeah, I tried planting turnips and, radishes, and they only grow down an inch or 2 in the soil, and then they just grow up from there."
right.
And you try to explain to them, it's not that big tuber that you're looking at that's breaking up your compaction, it's a teeny tiny little root that's underneath it. It's just like trying to drill through steel. You don't start off with a 1-inch bit, you start off with a much smaller bit.
Well, and I think that's a good point. So that small root is what generates the space for that larger
Yep.
tuber to go through. So I think that the actual, if you want to say the meat of that plant, um, I think it does break up compaction, but it has to be able that small root has to
Mm,
be able to tap through that hard pan or what's creating the compaction we're concerned about. And then the macropore would be that the portion of that um, root after decay or after say that sheep goes through and eats
mhm.
pulls it out and eats it. What's left is the hole in the ground, um, or better yet, the area for that the actual portion of that plant to decay, that's below ground, decay and then feed some microbiology there below the soil surface.
Yeah, so
Um,
it not only feeds that microbiology biology, but it all like I said, it also gives a place for water and air to get down in there.
correct.
These this the vast not all of this biology is uh oh, I can't think of the word now, oxygen limiting, anaerobic.
Right.
A lot of this is aerobic, some is anaerobic. A lot of your fungi are anaerobic, but the as you with this whole system working together where you've got living things and you've got dead things, you have to have a combination of the both. Like mycorrhizal fungi will only live in the soil for about 2 weeks after there's no living plant there anymore. So in the case of oats is fantastic for developing mycorrhizal fungi. But if you plant a field of oats, and once that oat starts ripening up and really looking pretty out there, all your biology is dying. Your mycorrhizal
Right.
fungi is dying. So that's the big part of having that living root system there. Now,
And oats are probably
I've heard in the case of mycorrhizal fungi that there are spores that they leave behind. So when that next crop comes in and it starts to go, it'll wake those spores up, and that mycorrhizal fungi will kick off again. But that mycorrhizal fungi, it's like the Craigslist of the soil. It's what sends out a signal from a plant that says, "Hey, I've got this kind of root exudate that I'm willing to put out, and this is what I want in return." And the mycorrhizal fungi is what sends that little signal out to the other that the other biology sense from it.
yeah, you probably need to trademark that before anybody else steals it because I think that's a great that is a great way to look at it.
Yeah.
And again, when we're thinking about the living root, like drawing this back to pasture rotation and the forage development that we need for quality livestock management.
Mhm.
This stuff goes hand in hand. Like
Oh, it does.
I think it's important to know about and to be aware of, and then to continue to make strides for improvement in our pasture movements, our pasture development, our maintenance of that pasture. Um, we need to know what's going on below the soil surface. But a lot of this, like, we are not repeat offenders of in a negative fashion against the soil health principles.
Hmm.
And even if we're not doing things what some people would say, if we're not doing things right all of the time, or what some would view as ideal, um, we're still improved over what we could be. And I think we need to pat ourselves on the back for that.
Yeah, I think this is what got me so interested in it as I started down this journey of rotational grazing and they kind of stumbled onto some of these soil health principles and some of these guys that have talked about this, and it's not just guys, but, Dr. Christine Jones and oh, Nicole Masters. I always have a hard time remembering her name for some reason. But you sit and listen to these people talk, and it is just absolutely amazing. But it didn't take me very long to realize that, boy, everything you do to create a really healthy pasture is the same thing you want to do to uh, create healthy sheep. And
Right.
it just made so much sense to me. We started pushing really hard for those long rest periods because that is just so good for that root system. Because I always take this to think that everybody knows it, but if you if you clip a plant off, within an inch or so of the ground, it sloughs all its roots off except for about an inch. And so to let that plant grow, it has to start its root system all over again.
Which is where the principle of take half, leave half
Right.
really stems from.
Yeah,
Um,
that's where that all came from. And just all based on that root system. And it's the root system that keeps that biology working. So when you kill off that root system, your biology doesn't it just completely changes. What ends up coming in is what's gonna eat all those roots up. And once that's gone, that biology dies. And your other biology that lived on living roots, it doesn't have a living root to live on anymore, so it's died. Then the whole
and I
process has
think
to start all over again, and this all takes time. If you
right.
are on that taller grazing and you're leaving yourself that good residual there, it's not just about what's happening on top. The major portion of it is what's happening below the ground. Um, you know,
And I do think there's a primary benefit to that, or the primary focus is resistance to uh, drought conditions.
oh yeah,
Below the soil surface, when we're thinking about having the root system, stay intact past 6 inches. If we're leaving, say we graze it down to 6 inches, we have those longer roots are dying off. We're producing new roots from 6 inches and deeper. Um, and this is just opinion. This has no scientific backing. In my opinion, that applies to being drought resilient,
mm-hmm,
which I think we need to be aware of.
yep,
Um, However, we are allowing, not that they need to be an inch below the soil surface. Like, there's other things that are occurring, but if we can leave that 4 inch residual
yep,
and we cut those roots back in the situation where we have moisture and we have rain, the ability for that plant to produce that root again, I think increases
oh yeah,
the ability for that root to take off again. And we're getting more decay of roots underneath the soil. That to me, when we're thinking about living roots are those that are going from that 6 inch to 18 inch
mm-hmm,
over and over and over again. But we need the moisture to do that. So, if we're in that um, heavy rotation, shorter rotation, or shorter rest periods, um, I think our soil health can't, as long as we're doing all of these other things, leaving enough armor, keeping not overgrazing so that we're not limiting diversity, um, but promoting additional root growth, I think it's something that we need to consider as livestock producers that um, we could have increased activity on the below the soil surface, just like we're going to see rapid regrowth during those cool season portions of the growing season. I mean, is
Mhm.
that fair to say? Do you
I
understand
think
my
it
train
is.
of thought there?
No, I think it is you when you're kind of in your take half, leave half, scenario, you're you're sloughing off very little of that root. It's when you start getting down and grazing much closer to the soil, that plant is very short. That's when that drastic sloughing off of the roots occur. So, but there's these little teeny tiny hairs that just are continuously growing, and they'll hit anaerobic pockets where they'll just absolutely die. And then another little teeny tiny hair will start and grow, and it'll grow a little further down into that little hole, and then it'll die, and that
Yeah,
kind
but
of continuous growth is going over, or is going
right,
over and over and over again.
and we need that turnover of material below the soil surface.
Oh yeah,
Yeah, it's
and there's biology that's feeding on those little root hairs, but
oh yeah,
it's
yes.
always it's always a trade. They put an ad there on Craigslist, and that mycorrhizal fungi, and something comes and eats it, and another root takes up whatever it's left behind, whatever that biology is left behind. It is an absolutely amazing system in how it works. And I will never be able to completely understand even what soil biologists now do understand. It's
Well,
mind blowing
yeah,
to me. you know?
and the crazy thing is, even in that field, what they know today is going to be less than what the hope is. They're going to know less today than what they do in 10, 15, 20 years.
Oh
And they're
yeah.
going to go back and say, well, back when I was looking at this 20 years ago, we thought it did this. And really, it's blown up. I think the more, it's very much like a space exploration endeavor.
Well, it absolutely
The
is.
more you dive into it, the more it just grows into something that it's very difficult to comprehend or to fully understand.
Yeah, I know 5 years ago I heard Dr. Christine Jones, I think it was, said that they know more about outer space than they do about the biology in the soil. That's mind blowing to me.
Yep.
And it's simply because there's nobody out there, no big company that can sell you the biology in the soil. So they're not going to fund the research. Although now you're starting to see the bug in the jug sales, buy our product because it's got this and biological that. And so those companies are starting to pay for research, and now we are starting to see more of that. So,
Or they're not paying for research and they're just cashing it.
yep. Either
That's
way.
that's the other
Yep.
option. But it's crazy. I mean, I it's just almost humbling, to go out and walk. I was rolling out a bale the other day, and um, you just knowing that you're contributing nutrients that are going to be on that pasture instead of whining and complaining that I'm out there freezing my tail off, can't get the sheep out of the way of unrolling this thing. Just trying to take a more positive approach to it of like, man, think of how good this grass is going to look with all these evenly dispersed nutrients that these sheep are putting back on this pasture.
Yep. That's what you do. So, well, we're coming up on our time here, Cam. I think it was a good discussion. I always hesitate a bit to discuss it because there's so much I don't know.
Right.
I feel
And
like all
and
I
I
know is
heard
little bits
you
and pieces.
right. And we'll have some other people on here that I'm gonna say allegedly do know. Um and it's fair to say they know more, but to your point that you just had,
Yep.
there is stuff that someone could listen to this podcast in 10 years and say, "Oh, that's interesting information." Well, they know this, this, and this that They didn't know that, like, it's
Yeah,
always going to be changing, and it's a hot
yeah,
topic right now. So it's
absolutely.
worthwhile. If nothing else, just remember underneath that boot when you're walking out in that pasture that you've got a flock of other living organisms below the surface
Yep,
that are contributing to the ability for you to graze those sheep
yep.
today.
You gotta, you not only take care of your above ground herd, but you gotta take care of your below ground herd too.
Correct. Yep.
So so we thank you for listening to another episode of the Grazing Sheep Podcast. If you want to reach out to us with questions and comments, you can do that. Reaching out to me at bigtomperkins@gmail.com. There's a Facebook page. You can go on and like and follow. And you can leave some questions or comments there as well. So it's been good catching up with you, Cam. Good discussing this stuff. So you have a good week, my friend.
You do the same, Tom.
All righty. Bye.